I'm sure you've noticed more than once those huge trucks parked for hours with their engines running and that constant purr that seems to give no respite. And then you ask yourself, why don't they just turn it off? Isn't it an unnecessary waste of diesel? The thing is, behind this practice, which at first glance seems illogical, there are reasons that are much more interesting than you might imagine. Reasons that can make the difference between a safe trip and a disaster on the road, because a disaster can happen. For a truck driver, the trailer is not just a vehicle for work. It is literally their office, their bedroom, and often their only refuge for weeks or even months on the road. So, the first big reason for keeping the engine running is simple: surviving the weather. Just imagine being on a highway in Canada with the thermometer reading -20 degrees. Without heating, the cab becomes a freezer. Now think about the opposite, a coastal city in Colombia where the wind chill can exceed 45 degrees, turning the interior into an unbearable oven. Without the engine running, there is no climate control, and without climate control, there is no real rest. And a driver who does not rest well is sooner or later a danger behind the wheel. It's that simple. However, comfort is not the only reason, although it is one of the most obvious. From a technical standpoint, a heavy truck is never ready to move if it does not maintain sufficient pressure in its air brake system. These brakes do not work with fluid like in cars, but with compressed air. Let me explain. When the engine is running, it powers a compressor that fills the air tanks and maintains stable pressure. If the engine is turned off for too long, the pressure drops and the brakes are locked for safety reasons. And that 40-ton trailer simply won't move, at least until the compressor refills the system. And guess what? To do that, you have to start the engine and leave it running for a while. In addition, the entire electrical ecosystem of the cab, refrigerator, microwave, television, interior lights, GPS, and other things depend on the batteries. And, as you might expect, these types of appliances consume a lot of energy, causing them to discharge in a few hours if the engine is not recharging them. That's why idling acts as a constant generator that ensures that life inside the truck continues to function. And there's another key detail: extreme weather. At low temperatures, the engine oil thickens, losing fluidity and lubrication. And if the truck driver turns off the engine, especially for many hours in intense cold, when he wants to start it again, the start will be very heavy, forcing the parts and wearing out the engine, even much more than keeping it running for several hours continuously at idle speed, that is, turned on. And yes, starting and stopping a giant diesel engine constantly can cause more damage than leaving it running. Starting in cold weather is hard and stressful for the truck. The oil takes time to circulate, the parts work without lubrication, and the turbo has not yet finished cooling down. That's why, after a long trip, it's recommended to let the truck idle for 2 or 3 minutes before turning it off so that the turbo cools down and the oil continues to flow. Even the security systems, alarms, satellite trackers, auxiliary heaters, and much more depend on that constant energy. A truck that is turned off can be left unprotected, and no one wants to see hundreds of dollars worth of merchandise disappear overnight. Of course, it's not all positive. A heavy truck consumes about 1 gallon of diesel per hour when idling or running at minimum speed. Just multiply that by hundreds of trucks in a fleet, and the expense runs into the millions. In addition, prolonged idling generates sludge. When a truck is running for so long without working at full capacity, some of the diesel fuel leaks into the crankcase, mixes with the lubricant, and reduces its viscosity. And, as you might expect, less viscous oil is oil that no longer protects internal parts as well, accelerating wear on bearings, cylinders, and even the turbocharger. For all these reasons, transport companies have begun to use telematic systems, which measure how much time each truck spends idling. These help save fuel and extend the life of the fleet. But in practice, the story is different. Although technology recommends turning off the engine, many truck drivers continue to leave it running when conditions require it, whether due to extreme weather, safety, or simply because they know that restarting it cold can be more harmful than leaving it running for hours. Now you know, it's not laziness or whim. Truckers leave their engines running because their lives, their rest, and even their cargo depend on it. The next time you see a trailer vibrating, remember, that sound is not waste. It is the sound of a giant that can never fall completely asleep.